Good morning, everyone. This is Ranger Jake here in Yellowstone National Park, and today we are filming at Yellowstone's Helibase in the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Just over my shoulder, we have Bunsen Peak standing in front of one of our fire vehicles here, and we're talking about the past, present, and future of wildland fire management as part of our 150th anniversary video series. And to do that, today we're joined by John Cataldo. He's our FMO, our Fire Management Officer. For folks that don't know a lot about wildland fire, he basically oversees the program here in Yellowstone National Park. He's been in the federal fire management service for over 25 years, and he's been in Yellowstone here for 12 years, and 10 of which are in your current position. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right, I hit all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and jump behind the camera and let John take it away and talk to us about the past, present, and future of fire management in Yellowstone.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jake. Well, at Yellowstone, we have a really rich fire history, would be the best way to describe it. We've got over 10,000 years of fire history in the park, all the way back to when the glaciers last receded from this part of the northern Rockies. And we have evidence of that, not only in analysis of the tree rings of the forests inside the park, but also in the pollen and the ash record in the lake sediments in the area. So we've got a really long, rich history of fire here. It's 150th anniversary of the park, but our history with wildfire goes back at least 10,000 years here. As far as the past goes, it's pretty interesting. It's sort of broken into a couple of thirds or halves. We've got the first 100 years of the park being in existence as a national park was basically a fire suppression era. First by the Army, the cavalry, and then the National Park Service, all the way up from 1872 to 1972. And during that period, fire was considered destructive, dangerous, unwanted on the landscape. But in 1972, we had a change in philosophy, not only in Yellowstone, but across the Park Service, where we started to understand and embrace the natural role of fire in the ecosystem. And we came to realize that this system actually depends on fire, and it needs it. And it needs it on the landscape to maintain this really diverse ecosystem and these great open parks and multi-age stands of forests, and it really kind of pulls the whole system together and helps shape it. And it's a really interesting place to be a fire manager and to do this sort of work. But so since 1972, so we're celebrating our 50th anniversary of what we call the Natural Fire Program in Yellowstone. We've had about 1,067,000 acres of fire on the landscape. We've managed about 1,260 fires in the park in the past 50 years, and we're really proud of that. It takes a lot of hard work to keep fire on the landscape and to keep over 4 million visitors and a couple of thousand structures and large, fast-moving fires all untangled and keeping everyone safe. And it's a big job, but we're excited to do it.
So for folks that aren't familiar with the size of Yellowstone, that 1 million acres roughly, what does that equate to percentage of the park that's burned in that last 50 years?
It's about half. So the park is 2.2 million acres in size. There's a couple 100,000 acres of rocks and water on the surface that we usually don't include when we're talking about fire management on the landscape. But so yeah, roughly half of the park. But I wouldn't necessarily say burned. I would say inside the perimeter of a fire. So it's a really important distinction, because naturally occurring fires on this landscape burn in a really mosaic pattern. So they'll burn very intensely in one area, and then they'll spread through embers in the air as far as a couple of miles away into a new area, and then burn another patch. And then they kind of leap around. So it's not, don't think of like necessarily like a burning wheat field or something like that, where it's very uniformly burnt or unburnt across that landscape. It really jumps around here, and we get a large variety of intensities and severities that result from fire in this landscape. So I would say 1 million acres have been affected by one degree or another by a wildland fire, or are inside of a fire perimeter, not necessarily burned.
And so that mosaic pattern that you're explaining, is that what we're hoping for? Is that typical? Is that atypical for when fires burn in Yellowstone?
Yeah, really typical, and it's ideal because you don't want even age class forests. You want multi-age class forests. They're more resistant to fire because the young age classes don't burn nearly as well or at all. It's kind of hard to get a forest that's less than 50 years old in Yellowstone to burn. That'll only burn under extremely dry circumstances. So having that multi-age forest intact, it's really an insurance policy against some of these, what people are calling now megafires on the landscape. You know, these million-acre plus fires we're seeing in different places across the West over the past decade. That these mosaic patterns are really an incredible insurance policy against those sorts of fires, because they just won't, that landscape won't burn as well.
So, and to kind of help you transition after my questions to get you back on with the present, sure, is, I mean, what are we fighting fires for today? Like, what's kind of the general practice of what's our goal with fire management in Yellowstone today?
Well, today we're just trying to continue to maintain that natural role of fire in the landscape. So there's a pretty big fork in the road for fire managers is the cause of the fire. So any human-caused fire, by policy, by federal policy, has to be suppressed. But about 80% of our fires here are caused by lightning. So when we have a lightning fire, we have the full suite of options, and that could be everything from just monitoring that fire. If, say, it's in a backcountry area, and we can let fire maintain its role on the landscape just by closing a handful of our couple of hundred backcountry sites and a couple of miles of trail, and let that fire do what it's supposed to do, right, in a natural environment. We'll look for those opportunities, but it's really all about risk management. Every fire that we get, that's our top priority, is what is the risk posed to infrastructure, visitors, employees, fixed assets. So it could be a backcountry cabin that's being threatened, a backcountry patrol cabin, or it could be an entire community like Lake Village and 250 some odd buildings, and the Lake Hotel, and some really iconic structures at the Old Faithful Inn. We've had fires during my 12 years here that have been in that vicinity, and that's something that rises on the top of the radar pretty quick. And the strategy for a new fire in that area is, will it pose a threat to that iconic structure or not?
Well, and based on this kind of present fire management, so since 1972, you said that's kind of the present day, the natural fire.
Yep.
So that 1988 obviously is after 1972 and before now. And so what would, everyone knows about the 88 fires, but to give some context, like what kind of happened that year, and can you give us a little bit of what happened and how we managed that, and did things that we might have learned from that year?
Sure. So most of the years preceding 88, since the onset of the natural fire era, so 1972 through 87, were pretty mild. They're actually pretty wet years. The park had a fair number of fires, but none of them had really gotten up and moved very much. This system's kind of on or off when it comes to fire. So like this year, for example, we've only had 3 wildland fires, total acreage less than 1 acre, versus as recently as 2016, we had over 100 square miles of fire in the park because it was an extremely dry year and things were ready to burn. So they had a run up to 88 of a succession of mild years, and they're being really successful with that program and picking some good fires out, some good lightning fires that were good candidates for keeping that natural process engaged. And then in 88, they had a a wet spring, and they thought they were still on track for another good year in that natural fire program. But then the spigot kind of shut off in May and June, and they didn't get that spring moisture that we're accustomed to. And they had some fires in the landscape that they were managing as long-term events for natural processes. And then in the first half of July, that picture sort of changed, and it became obvious that these fires were going to grow substantially and actually pose hazards to some of the infrastructure of the park. So they started fighting all the fires in the middle of July that year. And something interesting about that year that no one talks about, you say everyone knows about the 88 fires. They know of them, I would say.
Yes.
Or they think they know about them. But a lot of people throw out like 1 million acres burned. I hear that all the time. It's like, no, it didn't happen. We had 793,000 acres of fire in the park that were inside of a fire perimeter. We didn't burn 1 million acres. We had 793,000 acres of fire perimeters. And another interesting thing is that the biggest fire in the park was one that actually started outside of the park and received a really intense suppression attempt immediately and spread into the park. The North Fork fire spread into the park from the west side. And that's one fire accounted for over half that acreage. So if it wasn't for one start outside of the park that moved into it, we'd be talking literally about, I think, 375,000 acres that burned in 1988 in Yellowstone. And that's kind of a different conversation maybe than everyone throwing out that 1 million acre number all the time.
Well, and that 88 fire, you mentioned we had a bunch of years that coming up where the natural fire management process was working. Were we still kind of that fuel load? Did it build up from from the previous 50 years of fire management? I mean, was that just something that was waiting to happen, and the trees hit the right age, and the fuel just kind of everything came together at the right moment? Like, was that more predictable than not, or just kind of unlucky?
No, not unlucky at all. Right on schedule is how I'd characterize it. This ecosystem is characterized by stand replacement fires, but over very long intervals. So say 150 to 300 years between fires at a particular site. And that just depends on the productivity of the site and the underlying soil structure and whatnot in terms of how fast it gets to that point where it's ready to have that stand replacement fire. But when you go back in the fire history, there were probably 5 or 6 years since the last very significant fire event in Yellowstone, which was about 250 years ago, prior to 88, where if we weren't suppressing fires at the time, this is pre-1972, we might have had a quote-unquote 1988 fire season at that point. But those fires were put out and we never got to see. But pretty much right on schedule is how I'd characterize it. It had been a couple hundred years since a big fire event in Yellowstone, and that's what drives this system, and that was the year to have it.
So I noticed that there's a lot of variables in your just explanation on how to predict a fire, like soil and the age of the trees. How I guess that's kind of a two-part question, is who figures all of that information out? Like, do you have people out on the ground like sticking their fingers in the soil and doing all the stuff? And then how do you manage all that data, and like what sort of are there models that predict this type of stuff? Like what tools do you have to help you get an accurate prediction?
Well, we like to predict potential, right? So 80% of our fires are from lightning, and that's pretty random. So what we do strive to predict is the potential on the landscape. And something we're really proud of across the National Park Service as a whole is our investment in fire ecology and fire effects monitoring programs. And that's something we've been doing since the 1970s as well. So we look at, at Yellowstone, we go out twice every week and sample live and dead fuel moistures from different areas in the park to constantly monitor the potential in the landscape for a large fire. So if we get a new start, we can factor that into the calculus of how much risk that fire might potentially pose. Is it going to maybe move a quarter mile in the next 6 weeks before winter sets in here. And, sometime predictably in October, we'll get some snow. The 88 fires, for all intents and purposes, ended on September 11th with a 1/4 inch of snow is what stopped those fires, despite the efforts of tens of thousands of firefighters and $120 million. It was a 1/4 inch of snow. And that fire stopped right behind us on Bunsen Peak. I don't know if you can see it, the resolution of this shot, but there's a nice uneven age forest on Bunsen Peak. There's some real mature sites, and there's also a lot of area you can see that is newer. It's in its mid-30s now since the 88 fires, and where that North Fork fire I mentioned earlier had actually spilled over Bunsen and was setting its sights on Mammoth Hot Springs when we got that 1/4 inch of snow. But yeah, we're really proud of our ecology and monitoring program, and that's the intel that feeds the machine, so to speak, where it accounts for probably 80% of the information we're factoring into the risk proposed by a new fire start, and how far we can anticipate it's going to move all the way until winter sets in. And it's complicated, it's modeling, so it is imperfect science, but we do work really hard to use science in all our decision making. So yeah, it's ongoing. Starts with monitoring the snowpack over the course of the winter, then moves into snow melt and the timing of that snow melt. So does it come off slowly and evenly, or do we get a big flash melt where it just seems like it almost all comes off in 10 or 12 days at the mid elevations, and then all of a sudden we're greening up and moving towards the next stage after green up, which is fire season. We're monitoring the precipitation, and particularly in May and June is really critical for us. If the spigot shuts off in May and June, that's going to set us up for a season like we had last year, where on July 1st we were in very high to extreme fire potential indices, and we had fire restrictions on campfires. We were in what we call severity funding, where we were actually bringing in resources from outside the area to help us prepare for new fire starts. Because the beginning of July, we've learned, is a tedious time to have a fire in the landscape, because it is an awfully long time between then and winter. And if something gets established out there, and if it happens to be a fire in a place where we don't want to fire, near a subdivision or something like that, it's going to be a long summer dealing with that one. So
well, and I'm not having a fire background, this is like kind of a statement / question, but so if something in my opinion, it's like the other thing that makes it complicated is that fire resources are shared around the country, right? It's not like if you have a fire here and we have a bad fire season, but it's a bad fire season everywhere, then you can call in for help and maybe everybody's busy. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so that's a really important part of that risk management decision, is where is the national planning level, and what planning level are we at in the Northern Rockies and then locally in the zone, because that's a good indicator of how many of our incident management teams and hotshots and smoke jumpers and engine crews and all the folks that really make it go in the fire management community, how many of them are already committed to other priorities. And we're really mindful of that, and keeping fire in the landscape is critical for this ecosystem, but we're not going to screw it up by putting a few fires out for a couple of years. This is a long interval system. You've got 150 to 300 years between fires in the forested part of the system. The grasslands and the sagebrush is more like a 25 to 30 year system. The Douglas fir forest is more like an 80-year moderate fire intensity system, but we don't have too much of that. So mostly when we're talking about the forest here, we're talking about that lodgepole pine and that spruce fir down by the lake as well. But yeah, we really do factor that in. Like, are we going to be able to get the resources we need to be successful? And that was a big part of why we were so successful in 2016, was it wasn't a extreme fire season in other parts of the country, and we're able to draw on resources and bring folks in.
So other than, say, prescribed burns, what sort of proactive things can we do, like as fire managers, but and then more specifically like Yellowstone, like what are the things that are happening here when there's not a big fire every year? We don't just want to sit around and wait for a big fire, right, to come and burn?
Yeah. So we here in Yellowstone, we don't use much prescribed fire as a tool other than down the Gardner Basin to help us deal with some invasive species that have gotten a foothold down in that part of the park. Because the forests here burn so intensely, when it's going to burn, right? Back to that on or off. So when it's on enough to actually burn a forest here, it burns pretty intensely. And if we were to do that in some of our developed areas, we'd be creating more problems than we're solving, because we'd be creating a lot of hazard trees. A lot of trees that have a high likelihood of coming down and maybe impacting a building or, a historic structure, or, just being something dangerous that we'd have to deal with. So what we prefer to do, and this is a huge part of our present and our future, is to go into, and we've got about 1,000 acres of the park involved in this program, a 10-year program of fuels reduction in the wildland urban interface. So all of these, famous developed areas in the park, Grant Village, Old Faithful, Lake, Canyon, Tower, Roosevelt, Norris, and so on. We're going to go into those areas and reduce the fuel loading. When we started really in 2019 with significant advances in how we were going to approach that, we're using some heavy equipment in those pursuits. It's really a difficult environment to try to do it with some of the more traditional tools we've tried horse logging and chippers and, basically chainsaws and drag and brush and making piles and trying to burn those piles in the winter and all that. And it's so thick here in the forests around the communities. We're just not making the headway we need to stay ahead of the curve. And the curve is having a fire in the vicinity of that community and actually being able to defend it in the event that fire comes near. And that's happened, probably half a dozen times in different communities around the park, just in the time I've been here, where we've had a legitimate threat to a developed area because of a lightning fire. And we don't want to conduct those defensible space projects while the fire's bearing down on the community, right? We want to do that in a very out-facing and transparent manner, and do surveys ahead of time for critical resources, whether that's archaeological resources or wetlands or rare plants, that sort of thing, and do it in a non-emergency organized manner. So that's really what we're engaged in, and we're hoping to get through that. I think it's 1,050 acres total in all those developed areas across the park between now and 2029, and have kind of the heavy lifting behind us, and then just put those into a maintenance phase that goes on in perpetually, really, right? That's our job. Yep. In the National Park Service. We're managing natural processes, we're managing populations, and they're spread over vast landscapes, and we're tasked with doing that in perpetuity. It's a forever job. So that's the lens we look at things through.
Well, and that's kind of a perfect transition, is like in perpetuity, looking into the future. As a fire management officer, what sort of stuff are you guys thinking long term? Like, how has fire management, changed since you've been doing it, and what's that look like in the future?
Well, the big variable, and this isn't limited to Yellowstone, this is across the West, is what is climate change going to mean for all of us? And just in my relatively short career of 25 years, the informal definition of a big fire has changed by one entire order of magnitude. So when I got started in fire in the early 90s, I was on a fire that was a little over 100,000 acres. And at the time, that was virtually unheard of. You had to really go back in the history books to find a 100,000 acre fire, and people were talking about the Big Burn, comparing it to the Big Burn in the Northern Rockies in 1910, or the Peshtigo fire, or the Tillamook fire, these big historic fires somewhere, across America. And now it seems like almost every single year in one Western state or another, or sometimes multiple times in the same state inside of a fire season, they're setting a new record for either the most destructive, deadly, expensive, or just plain old largest wildland fire in their history. So this really is the era of the megafire in America and in the American West in particular. It's really a blessing here in Yellowstone that we have such a rich fire history. And as I mentioned, that's a big insurance policy on having that sort of event here, because we have such uneven age structure in our forests, and a lot of them are fairly young. So whenever we get a new fire, it's sort of already naturally bounded on one or more sides by another part of our history.
And a lot of these fires I'm reading, like in the Southwest or all the way over in like California and places, Montana and Wyoming seem to have a smaller population than a lot of those other states that like the fires are really, does that, also kind of, that makes us a little more fortunate than say other places where we, it seems like we have the structures in the park that we're defending, but it's not like everywhere there's a fire, there's a home or a neighborhood or like, a city that it's like basically butting up against out here.
Yeah, we are blessed in this part of the world with a lot of open and a lot of public land. But once you get an eye for it, and you look up into the hills outside of the park, you see the roof lines and the houses that are popping up in those forested areas. And even in a state as sparsely populated as Wyoming or Montana or even for the most part Idaho, there's still a lot of that wildland urban interface that has to be dealt with. It's a really significant hazard for firefighters trying to work in that environment, and it's our biggest challenge. We've hurt and even killed a lot of firefighters trying to engage fire in that environment, and we want to really encourage people to take those proactive steps to have a fire-wise landscaping plan for their home, for their community, so those places are defensible and we're not scrambling around in there with a fire bearing down on us trying to somehow defend it, because we just might not be able to. We might just have to walk away.
Yep.
So
as part of this series, I've been asking everybody just to share a personal anecdote, and I'm curious as if there's a year in Yellowstone since you've been here in the last 12 years that stands out more than another, as as far as fire, that and if so, why does that year stand out to you?
Sure. I would say without a doubt 2016 is the benchmark here for fire management during the time I've been here, and then really maybe even since '88 in the park. We had over 100 square miles of fire in the park, which is in the low, say 72,000 acres, I think, was the final tally. And what really stood out was how much fire we had in the '88 regeneration. So it was a real benchmark year for having fire back in some of those areas. We had, I think, approximately 50,000 acres of fire in the park in that young 1988 regeneration. And that's an area of concern, an area of research for us and our partners in fire management. And in the research community is what's going to take to catch some of this 1988 regeneration on fire. What level of dryness? You mentioned the soil earlier. What does the soil moisture have to be to support fire in that young forest? So when we have those opportunities to have fire in that forest type here, it's really is a tremendous opportunity for us to get a glimpse into the future and to help us manage those risks and expectations for fires in, really 1 million acres of Yellowstone that's got a forest on it that's under 50 years old. So that was just a really great opportunity. I'm really proud of our team that we had in 2016. The park was managing a big centennial event for Yellowstone all over the park, and we had a Type 2 team helping manage the maple fire out on the west side of the park, and a Type 3 team with a lot of local resources right here in Mammoth managing half a dozen other fires that were burning, and we all got through it safe and didn't have any serious injuries and didn't lose any structures, and had a lot of really good natural fire on the landscape.
So a textbook year is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's the way it's supposed to go.
Well, with that, I'm going to jump back on camera here. I want to thank everyone for following along with us on our virtual video series. I want to thank John for joining us today, talking about the past, present, and future of fire management in Yellowstone. It's a very interesting thing. We have lots of really cool information. If you'd like to learn more, we'll be sure to link to our website at the bottom of the video. But thank you for your support of Yellowstone National Park, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Take care.